Welcome to the Cracking Backs podcast. Today we're sitting down with Dr. Scott Leydig, a renowned sports psychologist, into the uncharted territories of post-pandemic sports psychology. We'll explore the mental battleground athletes face today, from the harsh realities of coaching tactics and the lure of extreme competitions to the combating performance anxiety, navigating body image issues, and the psychological impacts of a data-driven society. Get ready for an enlightening session on building mental resilience in a transformed world. Let's crack the mental code. Hey, Dr. Scott Leydig, welcome to our Cracking Backs podcast show today. It's nice to finally have you on.
Absolutely. I'm happy to be here. Can't wait to talk to you guys, and I'm sure it's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, what you do as a psychologist and a sports psychologist is in very popular demand, and especially now as repercussions from the pandemic, which I'm going to start by asking you a little bit about levels of anxiety, isolation, uncertainty, and a lot of people are experiencing. But how has that affected the sports world in your own words?
It was very difficult. It was very difficult to be a psychologist as well. It made my job rather difficult because it was uncharted waters. There were so many things and so many mental and emotional, behavioral, social skills that we've had to develop because of the pandemic. And one thing that I really saw was the increase in depression, the increase in anxiety. On the depression side, there was a lot of isolation. A lot of athletes identify as an athlete, maybe 80, 90, 95% of their being is being an athlete, and having that team, that organization, as they're feeling that sense of belonging. And when that goes from having that to not having that in an instant in March of 2020, that really threw a lot of people's minds through a loop. Saw a lot of sadness, isolation, depression symptoms. And then on the anxiety side, it was dealing with the unknown. Nobody likes change. Nobody likes the unknown. Nobody likes question marks. And we had, thousands of those. So a lot of fear-driven fight or flight responses from the mental, emotional, physiological side, as you all know about. And so a lot of different difficulties that people struggled with. So having to tweak and adapt some of my approaches and really drive home some of those interventions harder than I've ever had to do was really difficult, but we all made it through. But we're definitely seeing some people being a little bit more hardwired because of those drastic changes so quickly. So we're trying to do a lot of what I call software upgrades and trying to just tweak and rewire some of those mentalities in order to realize that we're here, we're safe, everything's okay, and we can get back to a more stable homeostasis from the top down.
So here's an odd question, though: did you notice anybody thriving through this, and what characteristics would you maybe notice? That obviously they wouldn't contact you if they were thriving, but would you have seen anybody do well, and why?
Sure. There weren't very many. Unfortunately, business was booming and still is booming because of the pandemic from the mental health side. But the people that had a lot of resilience, I work with a lot of veterans, and for example, those people are the ones who, if something goes down, I know they're going to be calm, cool, collected, and ready to act. They've been through a lot of difficulties, a lot of traumas. And they have a lot of resilience built up. So it's not just veterans, but a lot of people that have those sort of qualities as far as being able to cope with changes in order to be aware and have self-reflection of their insecurities, their anxieties, their weaknesses or areas for improvement within themselves, but also focusing on their strengths, having optimism, never losing hope. There's a lot of different traits or characteristics like that on a day-to-day, those are the people that if something gets put on their desk, they say, okay, all right, well, I got to do what I got to do. Or, oh man, I'm stressed and I'm overwhelmed and I'm freaking out. And then they get, worse off emotionally and not as productive. But, this was at a much more macro scale. But those types of people that are cool when they, under pressure, were the ones that were not cool during the pandemic, but they were okay-ish when everybody else was suffering, struggling, etc.
So comparing, I always love the terms that some of the college guys would refer to, NARPs, non-athletic regular people. I mean, I only learned that a couple years ago. I thought that was pretty funny, but
Yeah.
would you notice a difference between your athletes that would come in and NARPs? Because you mentioned earlier that athletes have a teamwork mindset, and when that teamwork is pulled apart, that's a challenge. And what about regular students?
Sure, sure. So I think it depends. So I always say sports can make or break you. Like, I work with a ton of athletes, and you all work with athletes as well, where like either they're going to rise to the occasion and work through whatever this mental or physical challenge is, or it's going to break them mentally and emotionally. So I think when going through certain changes, if they've built up that resilience, they've worked through so many different challenges in their athletic careers, I think they are pretty well able to adjust. But it depends on that ratio, like I mentioned a little bit earlier. Like, if your athletic identity is 95%, you're going to struggle. I always preach there's got to be a healthy balance. So let's just say it's 65%, and the rest of it is whatever we want to make that as far as our well-being goes. Like, that's a more balanced ratio, and those are the people that can respond to having something ripped away from them or any difficulty that they're experiencing. So a lot of NARPs can do okay too, but it depends on different experiences, different upbringing, different traumas, different challenges, different things that have shaped them into who they are. So yes, most athletes have a really great mentality moving forward through challenges. But when certain things, like I keep mentioning the athletic identity, when it's a little bit too high, that's when they have a big fall. Same thing with coping with an injury. A lot of people, as you all know very well, you'll see them come in sad, depressed, anxious about their future, anxious about their healing process, maybe fear of returning to play because of getting re-injured. So those things are very unique to athletes and performers. So we do see a lot of struggles, but they also have a lot of resilience because of their athletic challenges that they face every practice, every game. That is a different mindset than just like, oh, I'm going to go play for fun, versus like, no, I got my career, I got my college, I got my money on the line, everything. So like I said, it kind of depends.
Individual athletes versus team sport athletes. Would you? I guess it's per person, but would you notice a difference in that kind of that relationship with teamwork type of environment versus someone who's like a tennis player or or an ice skater or something like that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I actually really like the team-oriented approach and mentalities, because actually, if I think about it and sit back, I probably work with mostly individual athletes. Like, they're flying solo. They have it's I'm working with a lot of baseball players, tennis players, like you said, skaters, like lots of different individual solo sports. So I think having a good sense of belonging, I can't preach that enough. As a human being, as a NARP, right, or as an athlete, having our teams, having our organizations, and making sure that that's solid. Those are solid, good, strong, connected relationships. Like, that's really, really important as a social support, which is one of the biggest indicators of if we're doing well emotionally and we're happy. Usually there's a correlation with how strong they perceive their relationships are. So a lot of good protective factors when it comes to having a team-oriented approach and having that team support versus flying more solo as an individual athlete.
Is there like a set of questions that you would ask someone that's kind of standard operating procedure in trying to determine what they're, what they're feeling, and then how would you take the most common thing that you hear about and provide a strategy, so maybe our listeners might identify and be able to apply some of those principles? Well,
the first one is, how does that make you feel, right? That's classic therapy question, right? To get to those emotions, right? I had to throw that one out there. But on a serious note, one of the biggest themes that I work with NARPs or athletes is because I do work with NARPs, a lot of NARPs, in private practice, and I work with a lot of athletes, but NARPs and just general people in the community, is talk to me about the insecurities, right? So when we get to people's insecurities, they have so much to say. I'm a failure, like I'm not good enough. I'm this is going to turn out bad, right? And so even just from those little bit of insecurities or anxieties, I learned so much about their foundation of self-worth, self-esteem, or how they perceive themselves. And that's one of the biggest key ingredients to being a successful human being or athlete is you've got to have a good foundation. And not a lot of us do because of different ways that we were sort of our biology, our upbringing, our parental relationships, etc. But yes, getting to know their foundation from within is key. So asking a lot of questions about that can get a lot of good indicators of how they see themselves, how they see themselves in their world, or their fears of judgment or lack thereof. So that's one of the things that I would preach to everybody listening is know your worth, like kind of identify what those insecurities or anxieties are about yourself and figure out why they're there. And then if they're there for a reason, okay, let's talk about it. But maybe they're just kind of false things that our lives have taught us that we need to relearn and think about ourselves in a different light. So that's probably the bread and butter of what I do with a lot of people.
It was always fascinating that there's this phenomenon called imposter's syndrome. So your patients will come in and they may be at a rock star level, whether they're a high school, college, or pro athlete, and yet they feel these insecurities. Is that common?
Absolutely. Imposter syndrome, fake it till you make it. Listen, I'll never forget the very first time I saw a patient in grad school. I was like, what the heck am I doing? I had all kinds of imposter syndrome thoughts. Every insecurity came out. They still do, by the way. Like they're not fully subdued. But we all have that. But I think what's more critical that I help my patients with is what do we do with that? Because what happens is I call it like the 50-50 balls. Like I coach lacrosse, so I'm always saying those 50-50 balls with balls on the ground, who's going to get it? So same thing with this is we have the insecurities. They're telling us that we shouldn't do it, can't do it, or it's going to turn out bad. And then we examine that. And if we can push through it and win that 50-50 battle, then we're going to fake it till we make it. And then we're going to make it. But we have no chance if we listen to those insecurities and have them dictate what we do. So I think that's really another key thing is what do we do with these 50-50 battles? If we win more of those, then we're going to have a great life. And if we don't, then we're going to struggle and we're not going to progress. We're not going to excel. We're not going to succeed in our goals that we have for ourselves.
Interesting. I asked one of our psychologists many years ago at Miami Dolphins. I go, how does depression happen? Like you don't wake up one day and go, I'm depressed, or in fact it's so stealth you don't even realize, right? Is that something that it's like a cancer, you don't know you have it, and all of a sudden it becomes clinical, right? So how do you determine if someone is depressed, clinically depressed, and then how do you dig them out? Because obviously maybe they win here, but maybe that doesn't always work. I mean,
sure.
How do you manage that?
Yeah. Well, it depends on the nature of how it develops, right? Like you're talking about, there's an insidious approach where it's just been like a lifelong thing. Maybe they started in childhood and it's never really hurt them or affected them throughout their career or their relationships or their mood as much before. It's just kind of been more of like the Eeyore approach where they're kind of getting through life, but like they don't really realize that they're super depressed or they could be happier, right? It's just their norm. It's their baseline. Or sometimes we can have more of an acute stressor or event that makes us fall into a depression, like I mentioned, with coping with an injury, or a pandemic or a breakup, things like that. So it really depends on like the treatment protocol. It depends on how it developed. But there's a lot of different things that I do with patients in order to help make that spiral not as deep of a slope. And so regardless of if it happened suddenly or it's been a sneaky onset over time, it's about identifying how this impacts them, where it came from in the first place, and how to dig themselves out. And it can be really tough once that spiral starts. So I always just try to do a prevention model. I'm sure you all preach that as well with your patients. Like, let's prevent some of these injuries. Let's treat your body right, and it's going to be nice to you back. Right. So I really try to do a prevention model, even when we're aware of it, to prevent the sudden spirals, or if it's the more sort of lifelong depression, usually it tends to be some kind of self-worth thing, like I mentioned, or just like negativistic views about themselves or the future. So we got to really rewire and tweak those mentalities, which takes a lot longer. So yeah, it depends on the onset. It depends on the severity, but a lot of different techniques and tools we can use depending on how we conceptualize why this started in the first place.
I want to ask you about coaching strategies. I mean, not you coaching, but some of these kids. When I say kids, I mean even pro athletes. But a coach could be a mentor, or he could be a villain. And what we noticed over the years is there's been the pendulum has swung in a different direction, whereas the tough coaching mentality, browbeating and the Nick Saban style of like really crushing a guy's emotion and see if he rises to the top.
Breaking them down to build them up.
Yeah. Versus some of what Dr. Terry and I talk about is you get participation trophies, because you could be in a last place, and so the pendulum has swung in this other direction. And I still believe that, a coach, should be like a drill sergeant. That's just me personally feeling that way. But how do you navigate or help an athlete navigate that if they're really, they're subservient to the coach, but the coach is an asshole, or not,
right? Right. Well, and talk about the prevention side. I struggle. Like, a lot of coaches struggle with letting me coach them. Like, a lot of coaches have their egos, and that's what brought them to the top. And a lot of them don't want to hear it. So the ones that are actually receptive to a sports psychologist coming in, I'm like, thank you. Like, I appreciate like not having so many barriers to entry here when it comes to helping you, which will help your team. But like, you don't find that a lot, especially with the old school coaches. They want nothing to do with sports psych. I mean, sports psych still getting bigger in a sense over the past several years. But that's so I working with the coaches and having them be flexible on their approaches. I'm same thing with my kids. Like, I'm tough, I'm firm, but I also will show you that I love you, care about you, and I want you to succeed. And there's ways to balance that. And I think when we get too sort of soft on that approach, that's not good for coaches. And then also when you're too difficult or too rough and too not showing them that you care, you just want to win games, that's when athletes start to kind of reduce their motivation and don't want to play for you anymore. So that's one key thing that you were mentioning that I think is important for coaches to find flexibility. But the other side of it that you're asking about is the athlete, which is how do they cope with a shitty situation that they don't like, that they can't change necessarily, even though transfer portals and things, if we're talking about college, or sometimes we're under contracts in the NFL, you can't just leave a team, or any other sports, obviously. But it's how do we deal with things that we can't change? And a lot of times what happens with people or patients, NARPs, athletes, whoever, is we tend to feel like we don't have control. We tend to feel anxious about that. We tend to feel demotivated because we feel this like learned helplessness of no matter what I do, nothing's going to change. But what I try to do with patients is try to have them feel more grounded within themselves, try to have sort of a more mindfulness, more here and now approach to what can I control? What can I do in order to stay motivated? What are the intrinsic reasons why I'm doing this, as opposed to the extrinsic things like this coach or fans or this achievement, whatever. Like, just try to make sure we stay motivated from within ourselves, and try to block out some of the other things that might derail us mentally or emotionally or even physically. Not an easy thing. You would hope that there'd be flexibility. You could have a conversation with the coach, and they'd be adaptable to, trying to do a different style with you, particularly, as opposed to just being the same way with however many players. So, but that is a challenge that happens, where we can't change a certain thing, but we got to make sure we feel that sense of control, use our internal things that we can control, which is the mind, the way that we filter things, the way that we perceive things, and then our bodies, which is what do we do on the field or off the field. So it's tough, but it's very, very doable once I have the ability to sit with patients and talk to them about this process. Usually they haven't thought about a lot of things that I can see from a different perspective as an outsider, and say, well, hey, let's do this, and that, and I think it'll help you cope much better with this difficult situation.
You earlier in this commentary, you started to allude to something, and I'm curious. How much do you dive into a athlete's? Let's say they're complaining about their coach, or or the athlete himself is not coachable, or he's very emotional, or very sensitive, or what have you. How much do you go into the parental experience that they've had? Where's your dad? How's your mom? How's your relationship with your mom? Do you go deep into that stuff?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. So one of the key things that I do as a psychologist in my approach is we have to get insight.
Yeah.
We have to know why and how this one behavior or this one thought, how did it occur? Sometimes when we go back, we can't figure that out. We can't connect every dot, but we connect majority of them. And that is what makes the light bulb, I call it the switch, happen with patients, when we say, oh, so the reason why you're fearing, judgment from this coach or from, this recruiter or whatever, is because dad never told you that you were good enough, or mom, or whoever, and you never gave you praise. And then that's why you always feel like you need to prove yourself. And then you get too much pressure, and then you get anxious about being at the plate, and then you freeze up, because of that. So once they see, like, oh, it was because of this XYZ thing from my parental relationship or environment, or a trauma that happened, that's a game changer as well to someone's psyche. Then this light bulb goes off and says, whoa, like, so that's why I fear judgment, or I get anxious at the plate, or whatever I'm doing. And what I try to say is, like, that's the cassette tape, like we used it a while back. It was needed. We needed to cope. We needed to think about it, internalize it like that. But now we got all kinds of different podcasts and all kinds of different technologies that are more modern or more new school. Yeah. So basically, that way of thinking or processing things or filtering things in your mind is played out, right? Mm-hmm. So let's do that software upgrade, and let's do a new mental approach that's going to be much more conducive for your mental, emotional, social, physical well-being.
I love the way you spanned generations by, you mentioned cassette tape and software upload in one.
And you can tell I grew up in the cassette tape. My first cassette tape ever was Bone Thugs and Harmony. I'll never forget it. I was like, I got my first cassette tape at the Broward Mall. You know what I'm talking about.
Right. I'm from the eight track era over here. So
right. So you saw my era coming out, right? And I see yours coming out, But whatever it is, if it's played out, it's played out. Let's think. Let's do differently, instead of just doing what we were taught or trained to do in the past, because it's not so functional anymore.
I thought you were from the record player with the megaphone era.
Oh, that close.
No comment. No comment.
Yeah, close.
Mute me. I'm gonna mute myself right now.
I got one more thing on the coaching thing that I was curious about. I noticed that there was, and again, you started to allude to it, and I would like to really embellish a little bit on it. And that was, sometimes, you think of, I talked to some players about, a comedian brought up once, whatever happened to Big Mama. Big Mama was like, she could smack you in public, but she was a disciplinarian, and yet she loved you to death. And you always hear players talk about their grandma or their mom or something. But Big Mama she was tough and commanded respect, but there was love along the. And then the comedian said, whatever happened to Big Mama? Well, Big Mama is 16 years old now, and she doesn't understand the dynamic of discipline and love. And so a lot of the I would notice that some players that were being disciplined or something like that, that they didn't realize that there was an element that I really really care about you, but I have to be balanced. And do you notice or hear? I mean, do you see that difference in generations at this point in life?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that goes back to the flexibility, right? I mean, a lot of coaches forget to praise. And they just point out the negative. I work with a lot of dancers and performers, and that's a tough culture. Like in the dance world is they call it corrections or feedback, but it's really just, I'm going to identify like 99% of what I'm going to tell you is going to be sort of negative or something that you're doing wrong. And then that their brains get wired to look for the wrong within themselves. Right. And same thing with body image or, lots of different things within athletes, performers, or society. So I always preach to coaches. I'm like, give them some praise, do a 3-to-1 ratio. Do this with your partners, spouses, friends as well. Praise at least 3 times to the one feedback thing that you're going to give them. I call it the sandwich method too. A little bit of top bun with some positivity, a little meat in the middle that says like, hey, could you do this a little bit differently? And then bottom bun of positivity, right? So like a lot of that, if you can have that sort of ratio, but also be tough and have consequences, which a lot of parents don't know how to do nowadays. A lot of coaches are too scared to do it nowadays. But you got to say, hey, we have some contingencies here. If you do your process properly, then you will have the outcome of getting play time. If you don't, then you'll be riding the bench. You know what I mean? But also, if that coach can balance those contingencies with this 3-to-1 ratio of making sure they praise, show that they care about them, show that they care about their future, as opposed to just critiquing and finding the negatives, then you can have that balance where they feel loved, cared for, appreciated, because we're all human beings, even though they're athletes and you think, oh, I'm doing it for the contract. Like, no, we all are innately wanting care, love, affection, support, belongingness. So you got to make sure you promote those traits and those styles in order to create a good dynamic where you're going to have a good process and a good outcome as an athlete or a coach.
It's great stuff, man.
All right.
Love that.
I'm going to jump in, Scott, on something. And I kind of want your opinion on this. And it's kind of going back to a lot of people call it the lizard brain, our lizard brain that needs stuff. And we were watching a show again called Band of Brothers. And after we watched it, we looked at a documentary and it said, this is the longest time we've ever had peace since a major war. Now we've had conflicts, but we haven't had, this is the longest time we've had since we've had a major war. And it starts talking about you hear the greatest generation from World War II and what these kids were going through at 18 and 19 and all that. And we haven't had that for the longest time in history. It went all the way back to the Mongolians. And so I've also noticed something, and I've noticed this huge drive of, call them ultra marathons, but we have the Death Race and Spartan racing. We have the Barkley Marathon, where we're pushing people to such a breaking point, and they're becoming more and more and more popular. Is this something that we need, that kind of intensity from our lizard brain, and we haven't had it for so long, and now we're searching for it in other ways? What's your opinion on that, on the mental aspect?
No, great question. I do think that we need challenges. I do think that we need to push ourselves, just like you would preach, in the medical field. Like we have to do physical therapy. We have to make this area of our body hurt a little bit or use it a lot in order to repair it and make it better. It's the same metaphor for our minds, right? Like we have to be able to push those thresholds in a safe, calculated way, in order and be tested in a lot of different ways in order to know how we're going to respond to that mentally, emotionally, and socially, and behaviorally. So I think there's been a lot of things that have been shifting over generations, and I think I always say I'll be in business for sure because there's a lot of things that scare me about this generation and a lot of things that are going on, and I don't think a lot of people are tested in a lot of different ways anymore. So I think the more that we can deal with things, learn how to deal with them effectively, be taught the correct things from our parents, society, then we'll be able to be more resilient through a lot of these difficulties. But I've seen a lot of lack of skills when it comes to coping with a lot of different things more recently. So I like the fact that people are challenging themselves doing these Spartan races and trying to raise the ceiling on their physical or mental or emotional capacities.
But on that, I think there's challenges, but when you listen to the creators of some of these, they will tell you, we're designing this to break you. We're designing this to not we don't want you to finish. We're making it harder, and we do not expect you to finish. And the first time they did, maybe nobody finished, and then one finished. And so what's the drive behind that? And why do we sign up for that? Because I think our society is getting soft. And, I have to run a mile. Oh, that hurts. And now we're seeing these events that they want, pardon my friends, but they want to fucking break you and see what comes out at the other side.
Yeah.
Why are these popular? Have we become so soft? And how do we get out of this? And how do we push people beyond what they think they're capable of doing without having to go to a death race?
Right. Sure. Well, I think there's one thing I want to mention about that is there's a lot of us are motivated by different things, but it can be external things like rewards, accomplishments, money, whatever, which is a good motivator in a lot of ways, right? Like we want to get a paycheck, so we're going to work, or we want to win a championship, so we're going to work hard. But even with those accomplishments or achievements or external contingencies, we still want to feel good about ourselves. So I think a lot of those people that really are hungry, and really push themselves further than they've ever gone before, want to feel good about themselves. Not that they don't feel good about themselves, but they want that feeling of like, I did it, I accomplished this, right? So the external reward of like the medal is cool, but more of the internal satisfaction of like, wow, like I just crushed this race or came in whatever place or just finished it for some of these, which, I've never done one, so I can't speak on it specifically. I haven't won my 50-50 battle on that yet. But yeah, so I think that's one thing is just, the intrinsic motivation factor, like how strong is that within someone? And then, as far as, it's a very loaded question of like, how do we change sort of this softness that we see in society? There's a lot of things that go into that, but I think it really, in my opinion, starts a lot with the parental relationships and then the schooling relationships. I've been involved with a lot of different parents who I have to coach them on just like actually disciplining their children. I've had parents that say like, I've never put my kid in timeout. I've never, punished them. I've been in schools where there's like a no detention, no suspension, no whatever kind of discipline system, and there's no structure, and they've never been taught sort of right and wrong or felt the shitty emotions of like messing up, which is a healthy emotion to feel because then it'll make them not want to feel that again, right? So I think there's a lot of things from the top down that need to shift within society as far as how we do stuff and how we bring these kids up in order to see that shift go back to like having some mental toughness again.
You see, I think one of the things I saw another documentary that they talk about mental toughness during that greatest era of World War II. When they came out of it, there was more inventions, there was more change. We had all these incredible revolutions as far as in business and inventions and commerce and growth in the world. The byproduct, and I think when these kids were going through this, they had to do it or they died. Right. So they were pushed past that where your brain will stop at 15%. They had to go beyond that because if they didn't, they died. Right. Yep. And the byproduct is their brains exploded and they had inventions. The negative side, we have what now we call it PTSD, but back then they called it the stare, they called it, whatever.
Shell shock.
shell shock. So there's that balance between innovation and shell shock, and some of these death races, if you don't, if you could die, you could. I mean, you signed a will, right? And so you're pushed into that, past that 15%. How do we find that balance and get that innovation back in our brains? Because I think our lizard brain needs to be that. You know, we were back in the cave, man. If you didn't kill that thing, you died, right? So how do we find that balance back where we can push and get that innovation back and get that mental health without the side effect of shell shock?
We need to go back to the basics. Like one of my biggest pet peeves, no offense to every human being who uses it, is social media. There's things like that, or texting. I mean, there's so many basic human behaviors that we just are so 180 that are really detrimental to our functioning in society. So many times with patients, athletes, whoever, I'll say like, hey, like, what did you say to the person face to face? And they're like, well, I texted them this, which again, if you all know with text, it's like, you can interpret that. Like I've heard so many patients say, well, they put a period on that sentence, so like that means it was mean. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, or like I only got 2 like buttons on my Facebook post, and then now I'm depressed because I feel like nobody loves me. So I think there's so much with like technology and the new way of doing things. You can tell I'm a little bit more of an old school cassette tape player kind of a guy, But so I always have to coach my patients like, well, let's work through this conflict together with them, so we can learn conflict resolution skills, and meet in the middle, versus just texting or tweeting this passive aggressive comment. Of course, they're going to be upset at that and then clap back at you, right? So doing a lot of these sort of basic human behaviors, going back to a little bit more of the old school approach of talking verbally to people, working through things, working through the challenges versus some of the quick fix, immediate gratification kind of society that we're in right now. Like I know even for me, like I fall into that trap. If I watch a YouTube video, I'm too cheap to pay the like $4.99 probably to have the ad-free one. So when it's like wait 5 seconds and then you can skip, I'm always like, ugh, like I have to wait 5 seconds. So like I fall into that trap. Like I get it, but there's so many traps in this current society that if we can try to reduce those, go back to some old school approaches, I think that's really the best way to get some resilience, to get some harmony, as opposed to just kind of avoiding these different situations and then losing those skill sets.
That's great. Patience is a virtue. Yes. Yes. So speaking of that, let's talk sports injuries. Let's talk about an injured athlete and I don't remember the stages of grief, or the stages that, those 5 or 6 stages that they go through. If you know them, I would love for you to recite them, because I think they're fascinating to me, but most people don't realize which stage they're going through.
Right.
How do you talk someone through that? That has the why me thing going on.
Sure. And one thing I want to mention about the stages of grief is I did a maybe like 10 years ago, I ran a few groups called suicide or survivors of suicide support group, meaning friends and family of family members or friends who did complete suicide. And I actually tried to follow the grief model of those stages in a row. And what I found from doing several of those groups for a couple of years was that nobody goes through them perfectly, exactly like to the way that it. So from then on, I've said, okay, you know what? Like, let's identify the stages, but let's also know that it's okay to go from angry first, and then to depressed, or then to numb, or whatever. So that's something that we see with athletes when they go through injuries. We see a lot of grief. It's a loss of an identity, like I mentioned before, when that ratio is super high, which it usually is with athletes. Of their athletic identity being the majority of what comprises their identity, we tend to see that loss, that grief reaction, that sadness that can be numb at first. Then it can turn into just sadness. Then it can turn into isolation, where they don't even want to be with the team anymore because they feel so disconnected. Then they feel lonely because of that. They're disconnected and they're pulling away themselves. Then they're just kind of by themselves, not doing any of the self-care that they should do, which is going to make them not feel good as well because they're not eating right or they're not sleeping right. So that's that spiral that we talked about way earlier. And it's my job as a therapist to, be an outsider and say, well, hey, here's what I'm seeing happen to you. Let's see if we can tweak the way that you're viewing the situation a little bit. We're never going to, sometimes, everyone's like, oh, let's make it positive. I don't go for that sometimes. I say, hey, let's find the neutral first, right? Let's find the neutral. Let's put a neutral spin on this. Let's get you out of this spiral. Then let's go more towards your team, feeling that support again, versus doing the grief, the isolation, the sadness, and then that's going to make you in a worse place mentally, emotionally, and obviously physically. The mind-body connection, as you both know very well, we need to be strong up here and to be strong within the body as well.
Yeah, that's great, man. I would like to go into the idea of what social media has done to body image, not just for athletes, but some of our listeners are parents and even young doctors that are caught up in. I mean, I've seen some of my interns. They don't realize it, but the ones that might be listening right now, I'll go on social media to determine whether I'm going to bring them on as an intern or not. Some of the things that I see, I go, you're going to be a doctor and you're putting all the, your boobs online, your butt, your thing, like you're trying to look sexy. So, body image has become such a thing. And now with the NIL, the name, image, and likeness issue, some of these athletes that are not, high level athletes are creating a tremendous name for themselves because they're a beautiful male or female, a beautiful athlete that is marginal in their athletic prowess, and yet they got millions of followers, things like that. How what's your conversation with those that are controlled by that?
Sure. No, it's tough because there's a reality to what you're saying. I mean, like the name, the image, and the image is a big piece of what's going on in society now. And honestly, it's one of the saddest things that I see. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Like I love any human being and what they look like, whatever. But I'll have I work with a lot of dancers, a lot of ballerinas, and they tend to really struggle and with the body image because what they see in the mirror doesn't reflect reality. It reflects their perception of what reality is, right? So it's very difficult conversation with people that struggle with body image because it is such a big piece of society now, but also for their careers. Like we have to be in shape. I mean, people like Zion Williamson gets shamed all the time. Dude's a legit athlete, and I don't know anything about his physical. I mean, but that's not my judgment, as far as is he doing the right things or not. But it's one of those things that can really hurt our self-esteem when we struggle with body image. So a lot of performers that I work with and athletes and the NARPs, they tend to, if they struggle with not viewing themselves in a good external light, then they feel not very good internally as well. And there's a strong correlation to if they view themselves as somewhat desirable or attractive, then their self-esteem is probably where it should be. But if they don't, then they tend to view themselves as not good enough, a failure, etc. And so that's very, very important point that you brought up that I, sniff that out right away. And you can see it subtly when you're talking to people like, oh, hey, you look good today. And they're just like, no, I don't, like boom, done, body image issue. Like we got to work on that, or it could be a little sneakier or outwardly they're like, oh, thanks. But then like when they look in, like I've had several patients that will not look in a mirror. Like they do not own mirrors. They refuse to look in mirrors. That's how significant it can get. And I've had patients where they won't even go outside, honestly. Like they won't go outside. And it'll be looked at as agoraphobia, which is fear of being in social settings. But really it's I don't want people to see my body. That's why I won't go outside. So really big issue, really see it all the time. As you can tell, I'm passionate about it because it breaks my heart when they literally don't see reality. And that's my job, is to say, well, hey, there's also other realities out there besides the filter and the perception that you have in your mind.
You know what, Scott? On that, where they don't see reality, we're seeing the introduction on a huge scale of AI. Now, AI is not reality, but now they're making AI body imaging. They're making this. You don't know any more on when you look on something online if it's real or not. And there's great benefits of AI, but there's a huge negative side. Just like we talked about, there's a great benefit of war and conflict and all that by pushing that brain, but there's a negative side of the shell shock and all that. How do you navigate what's real and what's not real for these young athletes who live on TikTok?
And they believe it. They believe everything that's on TikTok and social media, and it's sad, it's scary. So it's just about education. It's about kind of challenging in the moment. I always say we're run on autopilot. We just kind of like see, and we're as human beings, we're taught to just make immediate, instant interpretations of things, and we don't really slow down and step back and examine, like, hey, is this real? Is this maybe have a filter on it? Does this, not really show full reality? And if we can just kind of step back, do some awareness checking, that can really help us see, is this legit or not? But so many times, things like the social media, the body image, or when I used to be on social media, I'd see someone, like, they take pictures of like their food and like this amazing gourmet meal they made, and I'm just like, I hate you. Like, I'm eating like a microwave dinner. Like, it would make me not feel good to see this, and I'm like, I don't want to expose myself to this anymore. Like, I don't want to feel like I'm a terrible, terrible nutrition or whatever. Even though I probably should do a little better on it when if I was eating microwave dinners. But like, I didn't want to have that feeling like I wasn't good enough,
Right.
or I wasn't doing enough. So I see that a lot, and so I try to have that reality checking. Show them that there's different perspectives than what they see and what they believe, and then I can try to convince them of the healthy ones that of course, admittedly, I think are the healthy ones. But that's where my training and my degree is in. Is we're supposed to know, like, this would be good for that person. So we want to convince them to think differently, because some of those perceptions can be way off.
So, from your perspective, what's a strategy for somebody to listen when they're a kid or they're a parent, on navigating this AI, because they're even doing AI dating now. So you're not even dating real people. It's like something from a movie, right? That you look across the way and, oh, I want a blonde, I want this, and then there it appears. How do we get this idea out and get this reality back instead of this virtual reality? What's a strategy that somebody can listen to and implement?
Limit the exposure and go back to old school. Like, I wouldn't. I mean, there's a lot of
But
dating
how?
apps. Yeah,
How do we do that? Because our kids are glued to their phone, and I see adults glued to it. I had a kid that was 8 hours a day on their phone, and I turned to the mother and I go, "Let me see your screen time," and the mother was 12 hours.
Yep.
How do we do that? I mean, it's easy to say limit their screen time or limit their exposure. How do we do it?
From the top down. Like, if that parent is on 12 hours, and they think it's okay that their kid's on for 8 hours, then, like, you got to help the parent. Like, many times, parents will say, hey, come fix my kid. Like, they have behavioral issues, or like they're on their phone too much. I'll look at them and I'll say, like, well, who gave them the phone? Like, I'm very direct. Like, I'm not like a bobblehead therapist where I'm like, oh, so your kid's like having behavioral issues. I'm so sorry. Like, I'm like, okay, so, like, there could be a decent chunk of this that is coming from you that's allowing their kid to be exposed to 8 hours of craziness on social media all day. So, again, I know it's a difficult sort of broader theme of, like, how do we fix this, but it's through that self-awareness, self-reflection, the advocacy for mental health. I do a lot of presentations, and with some jobs that I have, but I also work with patients individually, and I got to preach to them, like, hey, here's the things that you're doing that are actually hurting you mentally, emotionally, physically. Here's the things that we can do that will be much better for you. So it's basically just spreading the word any way that we can, and hopefully it clicks in them of like, so the 8 hours of my kid being on screen time isn't good for them. Like that's up to us as professionals to teach them that. And if they buy into it, then we're looking good for the future. If not, like I said, I'll always be in business.
And no human is going to live up to an AI dating. I mean, that's gonna be perfect. So I think we're looking for perfection, which doesn't exist. I mean, I always
Yep.
laughed at every Christmas card you've ever seen. I guarantee 5 minutes before that Christmas card was taken, there was a fight. Whether they didn't wear the right clothes, mom was pissed that the kid wasn't doing something, and yet the picture, oh, they have a perfect family. No, they don't. They were fighting just like you and I were. So it's like if you do AI dating, that's not perfect. That's not reality. Yet these kids are sucking into it. So when they do meet somebody real, they could compare them to a fake thing. And I don't. I mean, it's such a weird concept, but it's growing, and that's what is crazy.
I know it's the exposure to things that are not reality based. Like when they show like, oh, I'm on this amazing beach, or I'm having this amazing relationship. Like not a lot of stuff is posted about like, hey, like we had this conflict and we worked through it. So same thing with like the Thanksgiving picture where everyone's like at the dinner table, like like, but like that's cool. Like that moment was great, but like what was it like before that? Like how did you like why did this conflict come up? Well, how did you work through it, and how do you guys feel about it now? Right? Like those are the things that we're not seeing in a lot of ways. We're seeing a lot of things that don't resemble reality, but then people start to perceive it as reality, which again is scary. So that's where we have to do some reality checking and say, here's what life actually looks like. Here's what this, Tough Mudder race will feel like. Let's prep for it, as opposed to thinking it'll be a walk in the park to navigate a marriage or a race or, being a competitive athlete, whatever it is. Like, it might look cool on TV, might look easy, but there's so many things that are behind the scenes that you have no idea about. So let's get ready.
Well, here's a reality check for you, and that was what I had recently found out about. A lot of those big dating websites like Match.com, the eHarmony and all that. Now, I don't know how true this is, but it made sense. And that was they deliberately not match you with the perfect person because they want to keep you on their program. Because if you found the right person, then you'd be done with Match.com or eHarmony or Plenty of Fish or whatever one. I thought it was fascinating to hear that. And then on a side note was one of the biggest dating websites is Instagram. It was fascinating. Yeah. But again, it's not always a reality check as to, what's really going on because everybody's, providing their best foot forward. So anyway, so this has been great, and we're going to enter a phase, a final phase of our program called the rapid fire questions. And you seem pretty quick on your feet, Scott. So I'm going to ask 5 questions.
Stretch the brain a little.
I was going to say, how do I stretch my brain? Okay. And done. Okay, I'm ready. Rapid fire.
Rapid fire. Question number 1. What is the one thing you wish you could have told your high school self?
Be confident and go for it. I had a lot of insecurities myself, a lot of imposter syndrome that made me not go for things and not excel in certain things or push myself to those limits. And took a lot of it was mainly in grad school where they make you do like self therapy and self reflection, and I was like, oh, so I have insecurities and here's how they're limiting me. And I wish I probably could have done a lot more things and excelled in other ways if I would have not felt so uncomfortable going outside my comfort zone. So that would be my rapid fire answer.
Very good. Question number 2. Best tip to turn your words into actions. Meaning, we all hear and read, we need to do this, we need to do that. But turning that advice into an action step, that's a whole nother story. What would you suggest?
Self-reflection. Like self-awareness, like that autopilot that I mentioned earlier. Like we just do, we just act. We don't think too much. But if we can step back, do some self-awareness, do some self-reflection, and kind of like analyze, okay, like what's my best decision? What's my best choice here? What are the good or bad outcomes of these 2 different choices? Then we're going to tend to make the logical one for the most part, unless there's some other mental hurdles there. But just being able to take the wheel as opposed to being on autopilot. that would be the biggest thing that will help you do the things that you really want to do in life to make you succeed.
Love it. Question number 3. Your favorite song that gets you in a better place or a better mood. And if you can't think of one particular song, I'll go with a genre. So either one is fine.
Okay, you're gonna learn a lot about me. So I said that my first cassette tape was Bone Thugs and Harmony, right? So you can see a little bit of where I'm going with this. So a lot of like 80s, 90s hip hop is what gets me kind of like in the zone.
Really?
Oh yeah. Like my favorite song of all time that doesn't get me like hyped, but it's Nothing But a G Thing by Snoop and Dre. I mean, that's my favorite song all time. Anything Tupac as well. You're learning a lot about me right now. I wasn't ready for the rapid fire. Okay, you can tell. Funny. I wasn't ready. I would have had a more calculated PC answer. But my truth is anything hip hop related. Again, 80s, 90s, 2000s. Nothing newer really. Yes, that gets me in the zone for sure.
Terry, you got one? You got a song that fires
It's
you up?
not Tupac. It's so funny because Spence and he's like being from the NFL and all that. He just was pretty much raised with the locker room songs and all that. I wasn't. I'm more of a AC/DC guy. I'm more of a heavy metal. My for Triumph, AC/DC, Scorpions. That's my genre.
Oh my God, that's funny.
I can confidently say that's not on my playlist. Nothing against it, to each his own. But I haven't rocked out to get hyped up. But I can see why people love it though.
There you go.
Oh my gosh, that's great. Well, I guess depending on my mood, I mean, like Terry was right. I love Rick Ross. Rick Ross gets me so like I break out in a sweat with some of that rap, and then I think. But if you would have asked me right off the start that question, I would have probably said Leonard Skinner, Saturday Night Special, or Led Zeppelin, Stairway to Heaven. It puts me in this state, right, that you could feel like you could break through a wall.
Or even Aerosmith, Dream On. Another one.
Yeah, love those two. Yeah.
The funny thing is, I know we're going off tangent, which we always do. But when we first started this, Spencer mentioned a song called, and I can't even tell you, he will, but the title is "Cry Like a Bitch," and I ended up putting it on my playlist. That song comes up every time I need it, and I'll be like, "Oh, I'm done," and all of a sudden "Cry Like a Bitch." I'm like, "God damn it, Spencer!" And I just get going again. So that song in the last 2 years has come around, and it's always hit me at the right time. And
I forgot.
I would never have heard it if it wasn't know anything about it, if it wasn't for him. So
wow. I've actually never heard it, but I'll tell you what, I wrote it down.
Who's it by, Spence?
I'm going to listen to it just to pay homage to you both, and see. I'm going to see how it makes me feel.
It will make you feel. I mean, there's no doubt about it.
Oh yeah.
I'm mildly worried, but I'm gonna win my 50-50 battle, and I'm gonna listen to it. Okay, we'll see what happens.
Yeah, it's not a heavy metal, but it's a metal song. It's good. And then to be fair, sometimes something from the 70s or 80s, Shaka Khan. I don't know where my mood could be so diverse, but. Anyway, I love Shaka Khan, but that's a whole other story. Okay.
It's by Godsmack. It's by Godsmack.
That's right. Godsmack. Thank you.
That's a name of a group. Okay, got it.
Godsmack.
I'm learning. I'm trying not to analyze Dr. Terry over here.
You can.
You got to pay to play. So I won't do any psychoanalysis, but I will listen to Godsmack.
I will keep psychologists busy for hours. So
you know what? I'm full, Dr. Terry. I'm full. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
I never realized Godsmack is like blasphemy. That's like terrible. I didn't even realize that, but I love it. Oh, all right. I'm going to move to something a little more benign. Question number 4: If you could meet one person from the Question number 4: If you could meet one person from the past, who would it be, and what would you ask them?
Would Dr. Terry be upset if I said Tupac? No. I would say I'll go with Tupac because it's
right.
on my mind. I think he had a lot of different
That's funny.
elements of himself. But I think for being super, super young, he had a ton of wisdom. And I always try from a diversity standpoint to understand the Black experience. And I think he would have a lot of insight to share about what that was like. So I hear it through his music, but being able to have a conversation with him, I think would be really enlightening for me because he was very deep, had a lot of wisdom, and for such a young age. So that would be my answer. But probably because I was primed on question number 3.
Right.
From what I listened to. So.
Perfect.
That's right. Then you could always go with diversity and talk about Bob Marley. Very philosophical.
Here we go.
Different.
Listen,
genre.
when I want to get into a good vibe, I do put on like beach radio on my apps and like do a little bit of Bob Marley, 3 Little Birds. I got you. Yep.
I actually went to one of his concerts in Costa Rica, so it was pretty cool. So I can being a Southern California surfer boy, I can get into Bob Marley.
Nice. So we agree on some type of genre.
Oh, absolutely.
There we go. I feel more connected with you all now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do I get on your list now? Yeah. Will I get on your list? Or are you still full?
Still full.
God damn it.
Love you though.
I appreciate that.
Question number 5, last and final question. Most overused motivational slogan or statement that kind of drives you crazy. And if you have a better one, what would you suggest?
I can't think of a specific one that bothers me, but all I know is I tried CrossFit once, and I love CrossFit as a thing. But I remember I was the last one to finish, and I wasn't even finished yet, and everybody kept throwing out all of those like mantras and like, you can do it, like you got this. And I was just like, I get it. Like I'm struggling, like I'm good, like I have intrinsic motivation. I don't need the extrinsic. So I can't think of one specifically, but any along those lines of like, you can do it, like those I would say those are those. But actually the one that I do use though, and I use it myself, I use it with a lot of my patients, is like, you got this, right? Like you got this, like just plain and simple, like you got this with a period, no exclamation points, like you got this, meaning like just be confident, trust yourself. You've done so many things in the past, and you're going to be able to do more in the present and the future. So you got this is the one that if you hear that from me, and I don't say it unless I believe it, by the way. Like if I know someone struggles and I know where they're at, I won't say it. Like if I say that to you, so all the patients or listeners out there, if I say you got this, that truly means I believe in you and you can do it. I reserve that phrase for when they're ready, right? So that's my favorite one that I use for myself and for a lot of people.
Oh, that's great. Well, we want to wrap it up, and I just want to give you another second or two to, if there's anything we haven't asked you that you feel compelled or would like to share with our listening and viewing audience. If there's anything in particular that you'd like to sign off with, go for it. Sure.
And I appreciate the opportunity of being here. By the way, this was a blast. You guys are amazing, and I love being able to promote and advocate for mental health. You guys are amazingly schooled on the medical, physical side, but I know both of you, and you both obviously care about the mental, emotional, social side. So I appreciate guys like you who really put this out there for listeners to be able to find a way to learn about themselves from the top down. So I really appreciate being here. I appreciate you guys. I would just say, as far as an ending note, it would be do that self-reflection piece. Like in order to be a good athlete, which is what a lot of us work with, or if you want to, get through life, with a lot of success, make sure you do some self-reflection, some self-awareness. You got to know what you struggle with in order to fix it. And a lot of times we don't do that. So, and also I would say just know your worth. So many people struggle with the insecurities, the anxieties. So knowing that you have value is one of the most important things you can have as an individual. And also knowing that things will be okay. With the pandemic, like we talked about, with all the stressors, all the curveballs that come our way, all the changes, the challenges, just know that you will be okay. You will find a solution. You will execute it. Might not be the best one, might not be the only one, but you'll just pick one and you'll get through it just like you always have from your entire life, right? So knowing your worth and believing that you can do this and you'll be okay is one of the biggest things that I like to preach to everybody out there, in addition to that self-reflection piece. So again, it was great chatting with you guys today, and I hope all the listeners out there can utilize some of these approaches to better themselves, as an athlete or as an art.
Scott,
I love it.
Dr. Scott Leydig, you were absolutely fantastic, man. Really. I mean, there's so much juice in today's conversation. Thank you so much. Appreciate you.
I appreciate you guys. Thanks again for having me.
You and everyone else, enjoy.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the Crackin' Backs podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you follow us on Instagram at Crackin' Backs Podcast. Catch new episodes every Monday. See you next time.